In the winter of 1942, the endless plains of the Soviet Union were swallowed by a relentless, biting cold. The German Sixth Army had pushed deep into enemy territory, confident that the city of Stalingrad would fall quickly, as if the war could be wrapped up with a single strike. Soldiers trudged through snow that reached above their knees, each step a fight against exhaustion, frost, and the unyielding earth. The wind cut through their uniforms, and their breath crystallized into ice as it left their mouths. Every movement was an effort, every gesture slowed and stiffened by the cold that gnawed at bones and fingers alike. The landscape itself seemed alive with menace. Snow-covered fields stretched endlessly, broken only by skeletal trees and the ruins of abandoned villages. The horizon was a blur of white and gray, and the sun barely rose above the skyline, offering no warmth. Roads that had once been passable were now frozen over, turning the army's trucks and supply vehicles into useless hulks of metal. Engines refused to start, and weapons jammed in the bitter cold. Soldiers carried rifles that felt heavier than they had ever imagined, the metal frozen to touch, forcing them to warm their hands on their bodies before they could fire. Food became a constant struggle. Rations froze solid, forcing men to gnaw on frozen bread and boiled leather. Water was scarce and often turned to ice before it could reach their lips. Some soldiers tore pages from letters and stuffed them into their boots for insulation. Each man clutched his personal items as talismans against the cruel winter. Letters from home were folded and refolded, read and reread, a fragile reminder of life beyond the frost. The soldiers were young and inexperienced, many of them barely 18 or 19, sent far from home to fight a war they scarcely understood. Fear grew silently in the ranks. Nights were long, with only the wind and distant sounds of artillery to break the oppressive stillness. Occasionally, small groups of Red Army soldiers would appear on the horizon, their faces red from frostbite, eyes burning with determination. Skirmishes erupted at unexpected moments, forcing German soldiers to scramble for cover among ruined buildings, frozen trenches, and debris-strewn fields. Each encounter, though brief, was deadly. Snow soaked in blood hardened instantly, and the screams of the wounded echoed across the plains, fading only to be replaced by the relentless whistle of shells and the staccato of machine guns. The cold itself became an enemy. Helmets froze to heads, boots stiffened into near immobility, and even bandages could not be wrapped effectively around frost-bitten limbs. Officers shouted orders over the howling wind, but many commands were lost, swallowed by the storm. Every soldier became acutely aware of his own vulnerability, of the thin line between survival and death. Some nights, men huddled together for warmth, whispering prayers or recalling faces of loved ones far away, while others sat alone, staring blankly into the snowy darkness, listening to the sound of ice cracking beneath unseen forces. Despite the despair, discipline held the army together. Soldiers shared rations, improvised stoves from scrap metal, and exchanged techniques for keeping frostbite at bay. They developed rituals to survive each night-rotating centuries, burrowing into snowdrifts for shelter, and keeping rifles warm against their bodies to ensure they were functional when the enemy appeared. But every day brought new hardships. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point, food diminished, and the ever-present threat of attack loomed. As November passed, reports of Soviet troop movements intensified. Commanders dismissed some warnings, but the men on the ground noticed small, eerie changes. Footprints in the snow, shadows moving between trees, and distant flashes of gunfire hinted at a massive force gathering unseen. Some whispered to one another, their voices trembling in the wind, that the Red Army was closing in, that a storm was about to break upon them. Yet confidence lingered over confidence that would soon shatter in the coming days. And then, one night, the first artillery rounds thundered across the frozen plains. The ground trembled beneath the soldiers' boots as shells exploded in clouds of snow and debris. The sky lit up with flashes of fire, and the night air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite. Screams of the wounded cut through the wind, mingling with the deafening roar of machine guns. The battle had begun, and for the men of the Sixth Army, the winter had become not only a killer, but a relentless, unforgiving battlefield. Every moment demanded courage. Soldiers dug through snow for cover, huddled in ruined buildings, or pressed against frozen walls while bullets shattered the air around them. Some lost fingers to frostbite before they even had a chance to fight. Others carried wounded comrades through snowdrifts to safety. The sounds of the night, the crash of artillery, the whistle of incoming shells, the distant shouts became a rhythm of terror and survival, etching into the minds of every man the reality of war at its most brutal. The soldiers' thoughts often drifted to home. Some whispered prayers, some cursed their commanders, while others fell silent, observing the endless white expanse and the ghosts of those who had already perished. Yet, amidst this suffering, the Sixth Army pushed forward. Their objective remained clear: advance to Stalingrad. Each step was a testament to human endurance, a struggle against not only the enemy, but the very elements themselves. By the end of this first stretch of their march, frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion had claimed many. But the resolve of the surviving soldiers hardened like the frozen ground beneath their feet. They would continue toward Stalingrad, facing each new day with grim determination, unaware that the coming weeks would test them further than anything they had ever imagined. This was only the beginning of a winter that would become legendary for its brutality, and the Eastern Front was about to awaken in full fury. As the German Sixth Army pushed deeper into the ruins of Stalingrad, the sounds of battle became constant and unending thunder that echoed through shattered factories, collapsed apartment blocks, and streets buried beneath layers of ice and rubble. The men no longer measured time by days or hours. Instead, they counted it in explosions, in bursts of gunfire, in the brief moments of silence that felt more terrifying than the noise itself. For in silence, the enemy often moved closer. Despite the chaos, German commanders remained confident. They believed the Soviet forces were nearly defeated, that victory was only a matter of holding their positions a little longer. But for the soldiers in the trenches and buildings, something felt wrong. They sensed movement in the night-muffled footsteps, metallic clinks, distant commands shouted in Russian. Shapes slipped between ruins like shadows. And every day, more Soviet artillery began to arrive, firing from positions the Germans had thought were impossible to reach. Then came the snowstorm's massive white walls of wind that swallowed the city whole. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Soldiers could barely see a few meters ahead as icy gusts howled through the broken streets, carrying with them the unsettling creak of ruined metal structures shifting under the weight of snow. Men huddled inside buildings with no roofs, trying to warm themselves with small fires made from splintered furniture or broken doors. The cold sank deeper with every passing hour, and in that frozen haze the Red Army moved. On November 19th, the Soviets launched one of the largest offensives of the war. Tens of thousands of soldiers advanced simultaneously from the north and south, sweeping around the German positions in a massive encircling maneuver. Artillery pounded German defenses relentlessly. Tanks rolled across fields where the ground was so frozen they left barely a mark. Soviet infantry advanced through blizzards with a determination the Germans had underestimated. In the northern sector, German units were overwhelmed in minutes. Outposts that had held for weeks collapsed under sheer numbers. Soviet soldiers stormed trenches in waves, firing submachine guns, throwing grenades, sometimes engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat amid the snow. Survivors tried to retreat, but the wind and cold slowed their movements. Some froze where they fell. To the south, Romanian units supporting the Germans were hit even harder. Many were poorly equipped for winter, lacking proper coats, boots, or ammunition. The Soviets smashed through their lines, sending survivors fleeing in panic. German soldiers watched from distant positions as an entire Allied army seemed to dissolve into the snow. Within 48 hours, the truth was undeniable. The Sixth Army was being surrounded. Inside Stalingrad, soldiers felt the shift instantly. Radio reports came in fragmented and panicked. Officers rushed from one position to another, trying to organize defenses against an enemy they could no longer see clearly. The men themselves felt a rising dread, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing on their chests as they realized they were being cut off from the outside world. The roads westward were closing one by one, swallowed by Soviet forces advancing like a tidal wave. On November 23rd, the final link was severed. The Soviets completed the encirclement at the town of Kalach, meeting each other in a freezing, snow-covered embrace that symbolized the trap snapping shut. The German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was now surrounded. A pocket of defenders trapped in a ruined city, isolated, freezing, battered, and with dwindling supplies. Inside Stalingrad, the atmosphere changed instantly. What had once been a brutal battle now became a fight for survival. Soldiers felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a realization that they were alone, that no reinforcements would break through quickly, if at all. Some tried to hide their fear behind jokes or bravado, but the truth showed in their eyes. Commanders attempted to reassure the troops. They told them supplies would come by air, that the Luftwaffe would deliver fuel, ammunition, food, everything needed to hold out. But the men knew better. They had already seen supply planes struggling in the winter storms, arriving late or not at all. They watched as some aircraft circled helplessly above the snow clouds, unable to find landing zones, dropping crates that shattered on impact or missed their targets entirely. Still, hope existed, however faint. Some soldiers told each other that the encirclement was temporary, that the German army would break through soon. But with each passing day, the pocket tightened. Soviet artillery pounded the shrinking perimeter, turning open ground into death zones. Snipers lurked in every building, picking off soldiers who dared to show themselves. Streets became mazes of debris and frozen corpses. Inside makeshift bunkers and cellars, men gathered around small fires. Their faces were gaunt, their cheeks hollow, their eyes sunken from lack of sleep. They listened to the rumble of Soviet tanks moving outside, the crunch of snow under heavy boots. Some prayed quietly, clutching small crosses or family photographs. Others stared ahead blankly, as if unable to comprehend the nightmare closing around them. As days passed, food rations were cut, bread became scarce, meat was a luxury. Soldiers boiled water from melted snow and mixed it with crumbs to create a thin, tasteless soup. The wounded cried out for help, but medical supplies were running out. Morphine froze inside its glass ampoules, useless. Bandages were reused until they turned black with dirt and blood. The encirclement wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a noose, a tightening grip that squeezed hope out of the Sixth Army with each passing hour. But despite everything, the Germans continued to fight. They dug deeper into the ruins, reinforced positions, and prepared for the long, brutal winter ahead. They refused to surrender, clinging to orders, discipline, and the belief that someone, somehow, would save them. Yet deep down, every soldier felt the same fear. They were trapped in a place where the cold killed as easily as bullets, and the enemy seemed endless. And this was only the beginning. Inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, time no longer moved in days. It stretched endlessly, measured only by hunger, exhaustion, and the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. The German Sixth Army, once a powerful force sweeping across Europe, was now trapped inside a tightening ring of snow, rubble, and death. What had begun as a confident advance had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Every morning, before the pale winter sun rose above the ruins, soldiers crawled from their makeshift shelters, holes in the ground, shattered cellars, the shells of burnt-out apartments. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. Their fingers were stiff, turning white or black from frostbite, and their stomachs were empty. The cold gnawed at them constantly, but hunger was worse. It twisted inside them, stealing strength, dulling senses, sharpening fear. Food rations had been cut again. What was once considered a single meal was now divided into 3. Thin slices of frozen bread hard as stone were shared among groups of men. Some soldiers kept their ration tucked inside their coats to warm it before eating, just to soften the edges. Others chewed on pieces of ice to calm the ache in their stomachs. The lucky ones found a few spoons of barley or a scrap of canned meat. But most days, there was simply nothing. The wounded suffered the most. Inside field hospitals, where snow swept through shattered windows and settled on beds made of doors and blankets, doctors worked with almost no supplies. They cleaned wounds with melted snow, tied them with strips torn from uniforms, and prayed that infection would take longer to set in. The cries of pain echoed through the broken halls. Some soldiers begged for medicine that no longer existed. Others begged for an end to their suffering. Outside, the Luftwaffe tried to keep the army alive. Planes struggled through blizzards, flying low over Soviet lines to drop crates of supplies, food, ammunition, medicine, fuel. But the storms were relentless. Many aircraft crashed before reaching the pocket. Others were shot down by Soviet guns. Even when supplies were delivered, they were often not enough, sometimes missing by miles, landing behind enemy lines, or shattering on impact. The men watched the sky every day, praying to hear the drone of engines. Sometimes they did, but the sound faded quickly, swallowed by the wind. Inside the pocket, discipline held, but barely. Soldiers grew thinner. Their eyes sank deeper into their skulls. Their hands shook. Conversations became quieter, slower. Men spoke about food, constantly bread, sausages, warm stew, home-cooked meals. They remembered their families. Some fingered small photographs with trembling hands, imagining voices they might never hear again. Letters from home were read over and over until the ink faded and the edges tore, yet the fighting never stopped. Soviet snipers haunted the ruins, hiding in factories, chimneys, and hollowed-out buildings. A single shot could echo for miles. German soldiers moved cautiously, keeping close to walls, never exposing themselves for long. Entire units were pinned down daily by unseen marksmen, and every day, Soviet artillery pounded the German positions, smashing through rubble, burying men alive. The noise was constant, a rhythm of destruction that made sleep nearly impossible. In some parts of the city, the 6th Army tried to push back. Officers led attacks through streets that had no names anymore, only broken landmarks, burnt tanks, and bodies frozen in grotesque shapes. But every advance cost lives. Ammunition was precious. Soldiers searched corpses for bullets. Some carried rifles without rounds, hoping to find ammunition later. The Soviets seemed endless, reinforced constantly, moving with confidence while the Germans grew weaker by the hour. By late December, the situation was catastrophic. Fuel had nearly run out. Vehicles were abandoned, frozen solid in the streets, their engines dead. Tanks sat like steel tombs, covered in snow, useless. Even the horses once used for transport had mostly died. Their frozen bodies lay in piles, stiff and silent. Hunger drove some men to carve pieces of meat from them, cooking whatever they could over tiny fires fed by scraps of wood. Then came the coldest nights. Temperatures dropped so low that breath crystallized instantly. Men slept huddled together for warmth. Some didn't wake up. Those who did found frost covering their clothes, their eyelashes, their beards. Fire refused to burn. Water froze inside canteens. Rifles cracked under the cold. The city itself seemed to groan, metal contracting, structures collapsing under the weight of ice. And amidst all this, the soldiers began to understand a truth they had never imagined. They were not just trapped. They were dying slowly. some still clung to hope. They believed the German army group outside the pocket would break through and save them. Rumors spread stories of tanks gathering to launch a rescue, of generals promising relief. Men whispered these stories to keep their spirits alive. But as the days passed, the sounds of battle outside the encirclement faded. The rescue attempt stalled, supplies dwindled further. Reality was impossible to ignore. The Sixth Army was alone. Despite everything, the soldiers continued to fight. Not for victory had vanished long ago, but to stay alive one more day. To hold a little longer, to delay the inevitable. Their world had shrunk to a frozen wasteland of ruins, death, and fading hope. Yet they endured, driven by instinct, duty, fear, and the simple desire to see another sunrise. But each sunrise revealed the same truth. The pocket was collapsing, and the end was drawing closer. By early January, the situation inside Stalingrad had deteriorated beyond anything the soldiers could have imagined just weeks before. Snow blanketed every corner of the ruined city, covering destroyed vehicles, collapsed buildings, and the bodies of men who had frozen where they fell. The once strong German Sixth Army was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a collection of shattered units barely capable of holding their positions as the Soviet ring tightened with crushing precision. Inside the command bunkers, the atmosphere had changed. Officers who once carried themselves with authority now moved with exhaustion carved deeply into their faces. Their uniforms were worn, their voices strained, their hope fading. The radios crackled with static and fragmented reports: units overrun, ammunition gone, food depots destroyed. Some positions had stopped transmitting entirely, swallowed by the Soviet advance. General Paulus himself, once a confident architect of German strategy, now appeared smaller, quieter, weighed down not only by the cold but by the crushing realization that his army was dying. Maps pinned to the bunker walls told a story of shrinking options. Red markers representing Soviet forces had crept inward day by day, tightening like a noose. The German perimeter, once wide and flexible, had collapsed to a fraction of its original size. The troops inside the pocket felt this collapse intimately. Communication broke down between units. Some soldiers didn't know who was still holding the line beside them. Patrols vanished. Entire positions were found abandoned, not from desertion, but because everyone inside had frozen to death overnight. The cold was a killer as relentless as the Soviet artillery. The bombardment never stopped. Hour after hour, shells rained down, shaking the ground, sending shards of glass and stone flying through the air. Men huddled in cellars and basements, praying the next shell wouldn't find them. The noise was so constant that silence became unsettling when the guns paused. It meant the Soviets were preparing to advance. Supplies were now at their lowest point since the encirclement began. Bread rations had become symbolic thin slices shared among 5 or 6 men. Meat was almost non-existent. Soldiers boiled the leather from belts and boots, scraping bits of it into water to make something that resembled soup. The lucky ones found a few cans of beans or condensed milk in abandoned depots, treasures that men would guard with their lives. Winter clothing was another problem. Many soldiers wrapped rags around their boots to slow frostbite, but the cold seeped in regardless. Toes turned black, fingers stiffened until they could no longer pull a trigger. Some men walked on frozen feet, each step sending shockwaves of pain through their bodies. Others had to crawl because their legs could no longer support them. And yet, despite all this suffering, orders continued to come from Berlin. Paulus was instructed to hold Stalingrad at all costs. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was unthinkable. Reinforcements were promised but never arrived. The men listened to these announcements in disbelief, unable to reconcile the grand words of distant commanders with the frozen ruins around them. Many felt abandoned, sacrificed for a city that had already become a graveyard. Every day, the Soviet forces tightened their grip. They attacked block by block, room by room. Their infantry moved through the ruins with determination, supported by tanks that pushed through snow and rubble. Soviet troops used loudspeakers to call for surrender, promising food, warmth, and safety. The German soldiers listened, tempted, but most stayed. Some stayed out of loyalty, others out of fear. A few simply because they couldn't imagine walking through the lines alive. In the northern district, entire German battalions were forced into a fighting retreat, collapsing back toward the center of the pocket. The Soviets advanced behind them relentlessly, firing from elevated positions in destroyed factories. German officers ordered counterattacks, but the soldiers were too weak, too hungry, too cold. Rifles slipped from numb fingers. Machine guns froze. Mortar cracked under the temperature. Even when ammunition was available, some men lacked the strength to carry it. Inside makeshift hospitals, the scenes were unbearable. The wounded lay in long rows, covered in blankets stiff with blood and ice. Nurses and medics worked tirelessly, but they lacked everything: bandages, antibiotics, fuel for heat. The stench of infection mixed with the freezing air, creating a surreal contrast of cold and decay. Some soldiers begged to be taken outside into the snow to die quietly. Others clung to life, whispering names of loved ones, praying for a miracle. As January progressed, the Soviets began their final phase, closing in on the city center. Their artillery shifted closer, pounding the remaining German positions with devastating accuracy. The air turned thick with dust and smoke. Even the snow turned gray and black, poisoned by the constant explosions. The German commanders knew the end was approaching. They could feel it in the silence between radio calls, in the increasingly desperate messages from the front, in the haunted faces of the men who staggered back from the firing lines. Paulus studied his maps, but there were no moves left to make. The Sixth Army was surrounded, starving, frozen, exhausted, and alone. And while the world outside the pocket continued to turn, inside Stalingrad time stood still, frozen along with the men who defended it, waiting for the final blow that everyone knew was coming. Yet somehow, even in those final, hopeless days, the soldiers still held on, for pride, for comradeship, for reasons they could no longer fully explain. The end was inevitable, but it had not arrived, not yet. By mid-January, the German defenses inside Stalingrad were no longer lines, they were fragments. Little clusters of exhausted soldiers clung to whatever shelter they could find: the wreckage of a collapsed tram, the basement of a ruined school, the shell of a burned-out factory. The perimeter had shrunk so drastically that positions once miles apart were now separated by only a few streets. Every inch of ground was contested. Every wall, every corridor, every pile of rubble could mean the difference between life and death. The Soviet army sensed the collapse. Their artillery intensified, hammering the pocket with methodical brutality. Shells burst day and night, sending shockwaves through the frozen ruins. Buildings that had somehow survived months of bombardment finally crumbled, burying men beneath tons of concrete and steel. The constant explosions blurred together until the soldiers no longer reacted, they simply endured, flinching only when debris fell near them. The German High Command, refusing to accept the inevitable, ordered one last attempt to break the encirclement from outside. Tanks and infantry from Army Group Don pushed forward in Operation Winter Storm, but the effort had already stalled days earlier. The Sixth Army now listened anxiously to the fading radio transmissions, reports of units withdrawing, of fuel shortages, of positions overrun. And then, one day, the transmissions stopped altogether. The outside world had gone silent. Inside the pocket, despair settled like a second winter. Soldiers began to understand that no rescue was coming, not tomorrow, not ever. Still, orders from Berlin insisted that the Sixth Army must hold the city. The soldiers heard these commands with hollow eyes. They no longer believed in victory, but discipline kept them moving, fighting, surviving hour by hour. In the northern sector, a German regiment attempted a small breakout toward the west. It was a desperate gamble, a last spark of hope. Fueled by rumors of relief, the soldiers launched their assault at dawn, emerging from trenches with bayonets fixed, pushing through waist-deep snow. For a moment, they made progress, but the Soviet defenses were overwhelming. Machine guns erupted from hidden nests, sweeping the attackers down. Mortar shells fell with cruel precision. The breakout lasted less than an hour before collapsing completely. Survivors crawled back through the snow, dragging wounded comrades behind them, the cold burning their skin, the sound of Soviet laughter echoing faintly across the battlefield. Elsewhere, German officers tried to reorganize their depleted units. Maps were drawn and redrawn, but nothing made sense anymore. Streets had changed shape under the ruins. Landmarks had disappeared. Some companies had been reduced to a handful of men. Others existed only on paper, their members dead or missing. Ammunition was nearly gone. Soldiers counted their bullets like precious currency, saving them for moments when escape or survival seemed possible. Food shortages grew even worse. Soup was now a thin gray liquid made from melted snow and whatever scraps could be found. Some men boiled the remaining horse bones, scraping out the last bits of marrow. Others chewed on frozen bread that tasted like dust. Hunger gnawed at their minds, sapping their strength, making simple tasks feel impossible. The wounded, packed into overcrowded basements, suffered endlessly. Without medicine, infections spread rapidly. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs. The cries of pain and desperation echoed through the bunkers, mixing with the distant rumble of artillery. Doctors did what they could, but their tools were failing. Scalpels were dull. Bandages were reused until they could no longer be recognized. Some soldiers begged to be taken into the cold to die quietly, sparing their comrades the burden. Meanwhile, Soviet forces pressed closer. Their infantry advanced through the ruins with practiced efficiency, clearing buildings one by one. Grenades exploded in stairwells. Rifle fire echoed through corridors. Flamethrowers swept across bunkers, forcing defenders out or burning them alive. The Soviets moved like a wave, slow and unstoppable. Each day, the German defensive line shrank further, retreating toward the city's center. The Volga River loomed behind them, a frozen wall that offered no escape. Snowstorms swept across the terrain, reducing visibility to mere meters. Soldiers stumbled through the whiteout, trying to hold their positions, their faces covered in frost. Even speaking became difficult. Lips cracked, voices weakened. Yet, despite the horror, despite the knowledge that defeat was certain, many soldiers fought with a kind of desperate fury. They weren't fighting for orders or ideology anymore, they were fighting for each other. Comradeship kept them alive when everything else had failed. Men shared the last crumbs of bread. They wrapped each other in blankets. They carried the wounded on makeshift sleds through collapsing streets. In the darkest days, humanity flickered like a small fire refusing to go out, but the Soviets continued to push. Step by step, building by building, they closed in on the last pockets of resistance. The German command realized they could no longer coordinate their forces. Radios failed. Lines were cut. Sometimes officers learned that a nearby position had fallen only when Soviet troops appeared around the corner. By January 25th, the 6th Army had been split in two. The northern and southern pockets were isolated from each other, each trapped, starving, freezing, fighting alone. Supplies had run out almost entirely. Many soldiers had fired their last bullet days earlier. Some held empty rifles simply to look armed. The final collapse had begun. Men looked around the ruins, at their shivering comrades, at the endless columns of smoke rising into the icy sky, and understood that Stalingrad was no longer a battle. It was a slow ending, inevitable, merciless, and tragically human. The question that remained was simple, not who would win, but how long the survivors could hold on before the end arrived. By late January, the German 6th Army inside Stalingrad had become a shadow of its former self. The once proud formations that had marched into the Soviet Union with confidence were now fragmented, exhausted, and starving. Streets that had once teemed with soldiers now lay eerily silent, broken only by the distant rumble of Soviet artillery and the occasional scream of the wounded. Snow and ice coated every surface, freezing the remnants of the army into the ruins of a city that had become a graveyard. Inside the command bunkers, General Paulus and his staff faced the impossible. Orders from Berlin insisted that the army must hold Stalingrad at all costs, yet every report that arrived from the front line told a story of death, cold, and despair. Entire battalions had disappeared, consumed by Soviet attacks or buried beneath the ruins. Ammunition was gone, food was gone, fuel was gone, and yet the men continued to hold positions because they could not do anything else. They had nowhere to retreat, no reinforcements, and no hope. The final Soviet assault began in the early hours of the morning. Snowstorm winds whipped across the city, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Tanks and infantry advanced block by block, their movements precise, relentless, and terrifying. Machine guns tore through defensive lines, while flamethrowers forced survivors from basements and cellars into the open, where bullets and shells awaited them. The German soldiers fired their last rounds with shaking hands, knowing that each bullet might be their last and that many of them would never live to see another sunrise. The collapse of the defensive lines was inevitable. Soldiers retreated from street to street, fighting not to reclaim territory, but simply to survive. Some stumbled across frozen corpses of comrades, barely able to comprehend the scale of death surrounding them. Others dragged the wounded through the snow, improvising sleds and stretchers from shattered doors and crates. The bitter cold claimed as many lives as enemy fire, stiffening limbs, freezing faces, and sapping the strength of men already at the edge of endurance. By the afternoon, the Sixth Army was split into small, isolated pockets. Communication between units had completely broken down. Soldiers fought side by side with men they had never met, forming temporary alliances to resist the encroaching Soviet forces. Every street, every building, every ruined factory had become a battlefield, and yet each confrontation seemed increasingly futile. The Soviets advanced with overwhelming numbers, relentless determination, and precise coordination. Hunger and frostbite now matched the enemy in lethality. Men chewed on frozen rations, bits of horse meat, and anything they could find. Fingers and toes were lost to the cold. Soldiers huddled together in makeshift shelters, whispering prayers. And memories of home, longing for the warmth of a life that had become unimaginable. Medical care was non-existent. Injuries that might have been survivable weeks ago were now fatal. Infection spread unchecked, and men often collapsed and died quietly, alone, beneath the snow and rubble. By January 30th, the final surrender was unavoidable. General Paulus, who had remained steadfast, refusing to retreat or surrender for weeks, received the reality of the situation. The army could not hold out any longer. The Soviets had tightened the encirclement completely. Starvation, exhaustion, and the overwhelming force of the enemy made further resistance meaningless. The decision to capitulate was made, not out of cowardice, but from necessity, the only way to save what remained of the surviving men. On that fateful day, the remnants of the Sixth Army laid down their arms. Thousands of soldiers emerged from the ruins, hands raised, faces gaunt and pale, eyes hollow from weeks of suffering. The snow beneath their boots was stained red, not only with blood, but with the relentless reality of war. Captured soldiers were led away by the Soviets, many too weak to walk without assistance. The city, once a battlefield of incredible ferocity, fell silent under the gray winter sky. Stalingrad had claimed the Sixth Army, but its story endured. The struggle of the men through starvation, frostbite, relentless attacks, and despair became a symbol of both the brutality of war and the limits of human endurance. Commanders, soldiers, and civilians alike witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of strategy, ambition, and the unforgiving forces of nature and combat. Even after the surrender, the memory of Stalingrad haunted those who survived. Entire lives had been consumed by weeks of relentless combat and extreme conditions. The soldiers who returned, few and far between, carried with them scars that would never fully heal physical, mental, and emotional. The city itself remained a frozen graveyard, a monument to human suffering and the unyielding force of history. And so, the story of the Sixth Army ended, not in glory or triumph, but in survival against impossible odds. A tale of men pushed to the brink, of courage tested by cold and fire, and of a battle that would echo through history as one of the most harrowing and unforgettable of the Second World War.